I'm Sam, one of the founders of the Arweave project. I'm very excited to talk to you today about Web3, and I apologize that I can't be with you in person. I was exposed to someone with COVID, so unfortunately I can't travel for the next few days. But I'm very, very keen to talk to you about Web3 before the gold rush. So there's a little bit of a funny story to the talk title here. Back when we first planned this talk was when the market was in a much nicer situation. And now, as we can see, we've seen quite a lot of fall off from the peaks in the crypto markets. But actually, in fact, this graph is not from recently. This is from 2013, 2014. And again, we saw the same pattern in 2017, 2018. In fact, that first graph we were looking at is now just this tiny portion down on the bottom left-hand corner. And here is the latest crypto boom and bust cycle. I guess I would argue, and my reason for showing this is that we've seen this type of movement in the markets around crypto many times before. And really what appears to pay off is focusing on the fundamentals and filtering the noise. The argument goes something like markets love new technology, but they're extremely noisy and they tend to over-index on the short term and under-index on the long term. So there's something that the VCs really like called the Perez adoption cycle, where basically she observed in, I think this was 2003, 2004, that most major new technologies come with a phase at the beginning of sort of productive experimentation, followed secondly by hyper growth and explosion of the markets around these innovations, which then comes a bust moment where that market fails. And essentially, we saw the same thing in .com, in the internet era. And she also makes interesting observations about, I think it was the start of the steel industry as well as railways, interestingly, like a very long way back. So the same thing. So there's, innovation led by huge speculative market growth, followed by a bust in those markets, followed by, as she says, the third phase, expansion of the innovations created in the first phase into fully fledged products, and then phase 4 when those products mature. And so what I'm really trying to say is that we've seen this cycle not just in crypto, but elsewhere in technology many times before. I would argue that really what we should be doing is focusing on what is Web3 anyway? Like, why are we all here? And let's assess the fundamentals of this new industry and this new movement and see whether we think it's worth our time. I would argue, of course, that it is, but we'll see. So what is Web3? Well, fundamentally, it is protocolization of web services. That is, turning things that are normally run by a company on the internet into a protocol. A protocol, in essence, is a mechanism for computers to talk to each other and agree on a set of rules that are enforced. This sort of protocolization of web services makes them trustless. Now, that's important because essentially it means that you do not need to rely on a company to operate the service for you in order for that service to continue existing in its present form. So an example of trustless protocol is, of course, something like Bitcoin. The core utility of that system is that there simply are 21 million Bitcoins, or will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins. And you don't need to trust anyone in order for that to be true. Those are the rules of the protocol. And essentially what we've seen in the Web3 space is the expansion of that idea away from just, financial products. And I would argue that that even was an evolution of the ideas that made the web in the first place in Web V1, which was, trustless access to knowledge. Well, we then got trustless financialization. And I think that we're now seeing, the provision of trustless web apps, things like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of the things that Gmail, all the things that we use on the web today can be rebuilt now in a fashion that doesn't require you to trust the company that first built the product to continue provisioning it in its current form. These systems are permissionless. So if you have access to them today, you have access to them in that form tomorrow and any day in the future. There is no requirement to abide by the what do you say, the will of the people that originally made the service in the first place. This is a really big deal because it means that you can trust these systems to build businesses on top of. You don't need to worry that Arweave or The Graph is going to change something about their API tomorrow that bans you from accessing it. You can build a company on top with fundamental knowledge that the offering will be consistent. That's a really, really big change than Web 2. In Web 2, at the beginning, we saw a lot of companies that were created, like billion-dollar companies like Zynga, I think one of them was called, was making games on top of Facebook. And then one day, Facebook just came along and changed the API access requirements. And sure enough, now you can't get the games anymore. Or rather, you couldn't sell them in the same way. And so they were completely beholden to the platform. Well, in a protocolized web service world, that just isn't a question anymore. Another component is that these services are composable. So in the same way that you might use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, sort of programming languages built or layered on top of a protocol like HTTP, which is layered on top of a protocol like TCP/IP, and so on. You can compose these services together in a permissionless way. So if someone is building an application that's producing interesting, I don't know, maybe it's social media tweet-like things, posts. Well, you can build an application on top that uses that data permissionlessly inside your new application. And you have guaranteed access to that data set. So this is a really powerful new way of building systems that combine with one another to create, to create services that are greater than any individual subcomponent. We saw this first play in crypto in decentralized finance. So in DeFi, people would build simple systems, like, not a great time to mention them, but decentralized stablecoins, things like DAI that actually work. And then others would build things like Compound on top of DAI, which provide different services, and they can permissionlessly and composably do this. But we think that you can do exactly the same thing, but with data and web services, not just finance. And of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, you can financialize the assets inside web applications using Web3 technologies in a way that you couldn't really do in Web 2. Simple example of this is the NFT market that we've all seen boom over the last couple of years. So in this paradigm, if you will, you can program value as part of your application, and subsequently you can apportion it in different ways, and you can permissionlessly combine it with other things people are building to make your products better, which is just something that you can't really do in Web 2. So these properties can be used to improve, we would argue, almost all web service offerings, particularly this first component of trustlessness. There's really no web service in the world that is made better by the fact that you must trust a third party, a centralized party. There might be services where you want a third party to be able to do certain things inside the application, but you don't want to have to trust them. You want to be able to limit their power to editing certain parts of the system over time. Well, with Web3, we can completely change that. And it applies, I would say, it has different levels of value depending on the system that you are looking at, but largely there's no system that wouldn't be made better in some small way, at least, and in many systems a very, very large way, by having these properties. Interestingly, for you guys, I think, the Web3 stack has only recently reached production-ready status, I would say. There's been a lot of experimenting over the last few years, but really it's only in the last 9 to 12 months that we've actually got to the point where you can build an end-to-end decentralized web application that imparts these properties to its users in a reliable fashion. And so that means, and one example of this, we're very happy to announce this today at Graph Day, is Arweave and The Graph are now integrated. So you can query information from Arweave using The Graph now in a totally, or at least a progressively decentralized way. So the infrastructure is really just emerging right now, which means that all of the opportunities enabled in this, as the Perez cycle showed, in this innovation I guess cycle is the right word. In this innovative cycle, all of these opportunities are really only just coming to the fore where people can actually go and address them. And so we think that's an extremely exciting time to be operating, hence before the gold rush. It's essentially an enormous greenfield. There's so much that can be built. And that presents a few challenges as well, which is frankly, there aren't too many big Web3 applications we can look at this point. So if you're a builder in this space, you really need to have a little bit of imagination and I would say gusto to go and address some of these open questions and open opportunities and put the sticks in the ground and say, hey, this is how we should build stuff in this new arena. It's I would say extremely exciting as an opportunity. So, well, I come from Arweave. I'm the core architect of that system, and now I run the company most responsible in some sense, or most concentrated on making that protocol successful. Arweave is essentially the sort of base data storage layer for this Web3 stack. It allows you to store arbitrary amounts of data on the chain itself, so you get permanence of that data and also decentralization and trustlessness. It's how you can impart those properties that we were talking about when we discussed Web3 to your data, not just your smart contracts. The idea behind Arweave originally was to create this library of Alexandria asterisk that doesn't burn down. In fact, precisely that doesn't burn down is really the key point. It replicates data all around the world, and it backs that data with an endowment which pays out over time and generates interest, which can use to continue paying out over time to store data. The idea being that you just can't lose the information stored inside it. But it also can be used, and this is in use by the community to store all sorts of content from all over the world, basically to build an immutable ledger of history. But it can also be used to store web applications and the data inside them. So this, for example, is, you can't actually see it, it's cut off unfortunately, but a system called MetaWeave. MetaWeave is essentially a decentralized Twitter where the data that represents the application and the user's data is all stored inside the permaweb, which is essentially the data inside Arweave exposed to web browsers. You can go to this address in any Arweave gateway and you will see the same contents. And then you can transact with that essentially. So you can send transactions to the network from any of these places and they show up everywhere else. It is decentralized. And as the creators of MetaWeave, they don't ever have to touch this again. It just continues to run in an open, permissionless way, replacing where one of the areas I would say where trust is highest in relation to data, which is social media. If you build a social media following, it takes time, and that is an investment. And then if that is in the hands of a centralized party, you don't know that you're going to have access to that in the future. You're completely at their whim. Well, a decentralized system like this takes that cost of trust and destroys it. It completely removes it. You can sovereignly own your identity and your ability to speak to your audience using a system like this. Why is that important? Well, we all know in 2015, even, Jack, founder of Twitter, says that Twitter stands for freedom of expression. We stand for speaking truth to power. We stand for empowering dialogue. Well, we all saw how that turned out. Not 6 years down the line, they were busy censoring almost anything that was against what is essentially the party line of the Twitter Corporation, which is a really big deal. We want applications where you don't have to trust a company not to become corrupted one way or another. We want systems that are open, fair, and transparent, and the rules are set in stone from the start. Or something like ArcLight, for example, where it's, again, a permaweb application, and it's kind of like Bandcamp, except they financialized the revenue streams that you gain from people buying your albums. It's very simple. You build what we call on Arweave a profit-sharing token. You associate it with the album, and you say, instead of sending the tip when someone buys an album to the original creator, what we can do is send that tip proportionately to ownership of this other token. And you as the creator of that album can then sell rights essentially to the future revenue stream from that piece of data. And this is a very simple system, but allows the artist to be much more efficient, because they can take the money that they get from selling, say, a 20% stake of one album and reinvest that into building better studio for the next album and so on, and increasing the quality of their output in a way that you couldn't really do in the traditional Bandcamp system, where all of the royalties go to one person. You have to wait for them to accrue. This is a sort of financial innovation enabled by Web3 that we're extremely excited about. Okay, so that's an outline of what Web3 is, what Arweave is, where it fits into the stack. Here are 3 simple ideas just to get your, minds running on all of the things that can be built in this new web that we're collectively working on. So, decentralized source control. This sounds strange, but it's, again, one of those areas where the cost of trust is extremely high. That is, when you store your data on GitHub, your code, well, you and all of your users that are depending on that code are trusting that GitHub won't just decide tomorrow, actually, no, you're not going to be hosted here, which has happened numerous times. One of the most dangerous times that happened wasn't quite GitHub, but it was NPM. So a developer created this library, I think it was called leftpad, which removed or added, I forget, a simple padding to a string on the left, specifically the left, not the right. It's like 11 lines of JavaScript and thousands of modules depended on this in a tree. So it was only like, I think 250 modules that depended on it directly, but then other things depended on those modules. And in the end, it was like half of the NPM and Node ecosystem. Well, the developer comes along one day and says, what if we change it, lol? And it breaks like everything. It's a complete disaster. And it really shows that, well, we need permanent storage of the information in this system. When other people are going to depend on it. If you're going to depend on a piece of code, you need to make sure that piece of code isn't going to change and isn't going to disappear. Well, with Web3 systems and with Arweave as a base layer, we can do that. And you could easily build, using the graph, the querying layer on top to put together the UI that shows to the users what's inside this repository, just like github.com. Okay, another thing that would be really exciting to see is self-sovereign matrix networks. So Matrix is essentially a chat protocol, kind of in the vein of Slack, but peer-to-peer, or at least distributed, but not decentralized at the moment. This is a problem and an opportunity, you could say. The problem is that, you can't see because of where my face is, but this says, well, Slack leaks are the new email leaks. I think it's a reasonable way to sum it up. When we store all of our companies and our projects' information inside a centralized service like Slack in an unencrypted way, it is essentially inevitable that someone is going to hack Slack one day and release that information, and it's going to cause carnage. It's going to be an absolute mess in the business sector of essentially all across the world, actually. Well, I say that it's a smart idea for someone to try and front run this inevitable catastrophe and build on top of the Matrix protocol, which is fairly well developed and has lots of clients, but requires users to run their own server in the end, which no one is going to do. Well, you could build a decentralized network that runs these servers for people, enable end-to-end encryption inside it so that people running the service can't see what's going on. And then you can have the companies and the projects using this messaging platform be sovereign in their own, environment. So no one can take their office from them. No one can look inside their office, because Slack is basically offices in cyberspace, right? No one can look inside it, and they have a higher degree of safety. I think this is a, obvious opportunity someone could pursue. Forkable, trustless knowledge bases. So we have Wikipedia on the centralized web. It's one of the only remnants remaining really from the Web 1 era. But the problem is that it's governed in this fashion that is far from transparent. And also, it turns out, it is poor positioning. But it is censored across the world in many places. Well, using a decentralized network like Arweave, we can store the data in many places and make it accessible across the world through many different access points, making it much, much harder to remove access in whole countries. But there's other problems, which is that, for example, as one of the co-founders of Wikipedia describes, there's essentially censorship of the information being stored on the platform itself. And that's just a result of the fact that ultimately someone owns the servers somewhere in the world. It's not a trustless web service. You have to trust the people that are running Wikipedia not to censor information that they don't like. Well, that happens, and we can do better. There's actually an example of this on Arweave. So here is Arwiki, a decentralized, community-moderated and operated wiki running on top of Arweave. So anyone can suggest an edit to a page, and then moderators can look at it, and they can decide whether they want to accept the edits, but they also give some tokens to people when they do so. And in doing so, they distribute the tokens that are used to elect the moderators themselves to contributors to the platform. And over time, there gains a sort of community governance system that keeps the platform ultimately in check. And everything is open and verifiable. The log is clear and transparent. You can see who is doing what at what point. People can be elected and they can be removed from office at will if the community decides. But this is only just a starting point. Like, this is what already exists. I think there's a ton of different things that you can do building on top of the system, making the knowledge kind of more like a GitHub repo. So you can take an article and say, well, I don't quite agree that it's this way. Actually, I'm going to fork it and make, I'm not sure that the article is about socialism over there or something, a different angle on the socialism article. And that too can live alongside the original, and people can just decide which is the one that they think is most appropriate. There's so much experimentation that can be done in this area of running trustless web services. So if this is something that you're interested in, we at Arweave run the system that we call the Open Web Foundry, which is essentially a startup incubator for people getting started building Web3 projects. And we would love to welcome you and help you through the process from zero to your MVP, and then helping you raise money and get your product into the market. We would love to help. Go to owf.dev to find out more. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a fantastic day.